Hello friends, Pastor Chester Hitchcock here of the Gospel Memory Course. This is lesson number 18. This is the last lesson for the New Testament Gospel Memory Course. I encourage you to stay subscribed because I'm going to be doing the Old Testament Memory Course next, as well as 15 minutes with the book of Revelation. So if you have not subscribed to this yet, you will want to click on subscribe at the end and ring that bell and choose all so that you'll be sure to get a copy or to get a notification whenever my next video comes up. Today is a review of what we've learned in the New Testament. We're just going to do 50 questions, not 260, because we did 260 memory points, and I'm going to show you how to use this workbook that you can download from the website. If you have not downloaded it yet, you really should do it so that you can use the workbook to remind yourself when you need to. Now, don't be confused with the cover of this, because this is before it was online. When you download it, you'll just get the pages. But what we're going to do today is turn to the page where we have a self-test. And in that self-test, there are 50 questions that you can fill in the blank if you choose to. Actually, I choose to leave mine unfilled so that I can review them and remind myself. But what I want to do is ask you the question, give a moment for you to think about it, and see if you can tell me where it comes from, and I will help in the process to help you to remember how to remember where to find it. So where do you find the story of the Good Samaritan? How do you remember where to find that? Well, when I mention Good Samaritan, you might remember a dude in a ditch getting hit by a bowling ball. So that's going to tell you that that's chapter 10 somewhere. And then in your mind, you're going to think back, what book was that? Or what room did that happen in? And you're going to remember that that happened in the room of Luke. So it's chapter 10 of Luke is where you find the story of the Good Samaritan. And where do you find the story of the woman at the well? Well, you're probably going to remember driving your car up to the well and a woman helping you getting the water for the car. So if car is going to give you chapter 4, and what room were you in when you made that picture? That was the room for John. So it's John chapter 4. And where do you find the story of the rich young ruler? Well, you might remember that the rich young ruler is carrying golf clubs, and all of his golf clubs are golden. And so that's going to give you chapter 19. And what room were you in when you saw this rich young ruler? It was the book of Matthew, or the room that you placed Matthew in. So where do you find the man who was lowered through the ceiling? Remember, you turned on a light switch and you saw a hole in the ceiling and the man is lowered through the ceiling? Well, the light switch gives you chapter 2. And then you go into the room where you saw that happening, and that was in the book for Mark, or in the room where you placed the book of Mark. And then where do you find the story of the Pharisee and the tax collector? Remember that they were in a voting booth and you had to go in and you were going to vote for whether you were going to be with the Pharisee or the tax collector? Well, that voting booth gives you chapter 18, and then when you look back into the room, you realize that was the room that you placed the book of Luke in. And what about marriage and divorce? Do you remember? Do you remember that you saw a bride and a groom standing with a ball and a chain, and the balls were made of bowling balls? So that's going to give you 10. And then you're going to remember that the room where that happened was the room where you put the book of Mark. And what about the crucifixion? Well, naturally, you're going to know that the crucifixion happened in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so when you go to the book of Matthew, you just need to scan the book of Matthew, and you're going to come and you're going to see them gambling with dice at night that glowed in the dark. So that's 27, and it's in Matthew 27. And then when you go to the book of Mark, you're going to scan the book of Mark, and you're going to realize, oh, that's where the paycheck was, where Jesus paid the price for our sins. And then when you go into the book of Luke and you look around and scan the book of Luke, you're going to see an electric stool And you're asking the question, was he crucified or electrified? Crucified or electrified? So that's chapter 23. And then when you go to the book of John, you remember that you used, or someone used, your golf club to pierce his side, which is John chapter 19. Is that amazing? You've got a harmony of the Gospels there. And where do you find the parable of the sower? Well, you remember you backed your car into the book of Mark and you unload seed to be sowing. And so that's in Mark chapter 4. And then you also remember that in Matthew, you saw this witch who was stirring a cauldron and she put seeds for sowing as well as a mustard seed and leaven. You know, so that's where the witch is stirring. So you know that's chapter 13 of Matthew. And where do you find Lazarus being raised from the dead? Remember, around his tomb was a goalpost around his tomb? So that's chapter 11. And what room was that in? That's in the room where you put the book of John. And how about the 10 virgins? Remember, they wanted to buy a quarter's worth of oil? And a quarter's worth of oil tells you it's chapter 25. And what room was it when you saw that? That was in the book in the room where you put the book of Matthew. And if I'm going too fast for you, just review and see if you can keep up. But you probably are getting these before I'm telling them to you. Where did Jesus feed the 4,000? There's actually 2 places. Remember, you are skating around with your skates and you're feeding people at the car, which is telling you the 4,000, but the skating is chapter 8, and that's happening in the book of Mark. And also you remember that Jesus is writing out these checks so that you can go buy food to feed the 4,000, and that happens in the book of Matthew. And where do you find Jesus feeding the 5,000? Well, remember, you put on gloves for the 5,000, and that you're actually reaching in and you are getting scratched by cats as you're trying to feed the 5,000 cats. And that happens to be in the book of Luke. So the cats tell you that that's chapter 9. You put on the gloves, not that it's chapter 5, but you put on the gloves to remind you that that's the 5,000. And where do you find the birth of Jesus? Well, you find the birth of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1, because there's the Christmas tree and you see the manger scene underneath the Christmas tree, and you find it in Luke chapter 2. And then where do you find John walking on water? I gave it away too soon. Where do you find Jesus walking on water? Well, you find that in the book of John, because in the book of John you're bringing your water walking shoes, and you're bringing your Ghostbuster guns to chase the ghosts out because there's water on the floor, and you find that Jesus is just practicing his water walking skills. And how about Jesus calming the storm? Well, you're skating and you're trying to skate while the room is swishing and swashing like a boat. And that happens to be in chapter 8. And what book was that in? That was in the room for the book of Luke. And what about in vain they worship me? Remember, there were those who were playing dice, and you told them they couldn't play dice, and they said, oh, well, when we win this you could shoot this stuff in your veins that help you to worship God better. In vain, Jesus said, they worship me for teaching his commandments, the doctrines of men. Well, that's in Mark chapter 7, because they're gambling with number 7. And how about Jesus as the good shepherd? Remember, you were wanting to roll your bowling ball and the sheep were in the way, and Jesus says, sheep, and the sheep all jump to the side, and so the bowling ball tells you it's chapter 9, and that happened in the room where you put the book of John. And how about consider the cost? Consider the cost, and then you're thinking about rings, considering the cost of these rings, and then you look and you realize that is chapter 14, and you realize that happened in the book of Luke, Luke 14. We're speeding up here a little bit here. And how about the baptism of Jesus? The baptism of Jesus, you're standing on a stool in Matthew, and you're standing on a stool in Luke. So both of those are chapter 3 of Matthew and Luke. And in chapter 1, you see it, the towel that's on the limb of the tree. So it's chapter 1 of Mark. And how about the Word became flesh? Remember that the tree was one of those trees like what you saw in The Wizard of Oz. It was live because it actually had flesh, and that's in the book of John. And how about Jesus cleansing the lepers? Remember, here are all of these magazines of all of these lepers that were cleansed, and there's a bowling ball sitting on top of it to tell you that they're 10 lepers. And this magazine is all about all of these leopards that were in the magazines full of leopards. Okay, and that's where? In the book of Luke. So in the book of Luke chapter 17, and where do you find the wicked vine dressers? Well, you find the wicked vine dressers in two different places. Remember, where these people are throwing eggs that were growing on the vine, and so that tells you it's chapter 12. In what room was that? Those people were throwing those eggs in the book in the room for the book of Mark. And also they were smoking cigarettes and putting out their cigarettes on the grapes. And so the cigarettes tells you it's chapter 20 in what book? In the room where you find the book of Luke. And how about John the Baptist is in prison? Well, you find John the Baptist in prison behind a goalpost, and it's in the book of Matthew. Do you see how easy this is whenever we start looking for the picture? And when you want to know where the story is, you look for the picture. Now, Jesus preaching in a synagogue. Where is he preaching in a synagogue? He's standing on a stool, and he's preaching in what room? He's preaching in the room where you have the book of Mark. Zacchaeus in a tree. Remember, you're trying to swing your golf club, and as you swing your golf club up, somebody grabs a hold of that golf club because he's in a sycamore tree, and Zacchaeus is in a sycamore tree. And where does that happen? That's chapter 19, and it's in the room for the book of Luke. And how about Jesus prays for all the people? Remember, he's got a magazine there, and he's praying for all of these people, and that magazine tells you that it's chapter 17, and that's in the book of John. And how about the demon-possessed man? Remember, chapter 5, and that's in the book of Mark. That goes way back to the very beginning. And how about do not judge? Remember, somebody's throwing dice again, and this time you decide you're not going to judge them. Even though they're gambling, you're not going to judge them. There's nothing wrong with playing dice on some games, but of course some games when they're just gambling, that's what we've been talking about in the lesson. You decide you're not going to judge them. Why? Because you're in the book of Matthew, and you've decided not to judge them. And so that's in chapter 7 of Matthew. Jesus chases the money changers out of the temple. Where does that happen? Remember, this cake is brought into the book of Matthew, and a woman jumps out in a bathing suit, and you say, whoa, wait a minute, we're going to run this out of here. This is not what we want. This is the wrong cake, wrong church. We're going to run them out of the temple here. Okay? How about Jesus talks with Nicodemus? Remember, we're watching Nick at Night, and what are we sitting on? We're sitting on stools. And what room are we watching Nick at Night on stools? In the book of John. In the room for the book of John. Do you see how easy it is to find these pictures when you've got these funny pictures and you've got these numbers that have meaning, and you can find the Bible stories? How about Jesus is the true vine? Remember, this vine has paychecks that are growing on it because they're true paychecks, and it's a true vine, and this true paycheck vine is growing in the book of John, and of course the paycheck tells you it's chapter 15. And how about the Star of Bethlehem? It's on a Christmas tree. When you turn the light switch on, the star lights up, and that's in the book of Matthew, chapter 2. And how about Jesus turns the water into wine? Remember? Turns into water, turns into wine. Turns into water, turns into wine. When you're flipping the switch on and off, so that tells us it's a chapter 2. And that happens in what room? The room where you put the book of John. John chapter 2. I've kind of lost my place here. How about when John the Baptist was killed? Remember, there's a ring that's laying there, so that tells us it's chapter 14, and that ring is a wonderful relic, but nobody's taking it because it was John the Baptist, and that's in the book of Matthew. Matthew chapter 14. How about Jesus heals a man by the pool of Bethesda? Remember, you have a glove and you're stirring the water so that the pool can be, the people who gets in can be healed, and that's happening in chapter 5 of the book of John. How about Ananias and Sapphira? We're moving away from the Gospels here a little bit. Ananias and Sapphira. Remember Ananias and Sapphira, you had to put your gloves on and carry them out because they died. And what room is that in? It's in the book where you put the book, it's in the room where you put the book of Acts. Acts chapter 5. How about we are at peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ? Remember those gloves that only have peace signs? And where was that in the book of Romans? In the book of Romans chapter 5, because it's gloves and they only have 2 fingers. And how about the foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of man? Remember, you go into this room of 1 Corinthians and you have this tree, and here are these gowns that are hanging on the tree, and some of them are foolish costumes and some of them are wise costumes. The foolishness of God is greater than the wisdom of men. How about the armor of God? Remember, you're taking a BB gun and you're shooting this armor, or you're taking any kind of gun and trying to shoot the armor to see what penetrates it. So it's 6. And where did that happen? Happened in the room where you put the book of Ephesians. And how about what goes round comes around? We're getting there. We're almost finished, folks. Hang in here. Keep with me. Where do you find the story of what goes round comes around? It's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, because there's a merry-go-round that goes around and around the tree. Catching up with myself here. How about the law was a tutor to bring us to Christ? Remember that you're sitting on the stool and you need a tutor because you are foolish. So that's where you find the story of "O foolish Galatians," and the law was a tutor to bring us to Christ. And that is in Galatians, the book of the galley in the kitchen, possibly. And it's in the book of Galatians. And where do you find "silver and gold have I none"? Remember, you have this chandelier that you're trying to get on a stool and climb up onto the stool to get in the chandelier that is silver and gold. And the stool is going to tell you chapter 3, and that is also in the book of Acts. And how about Paul states that he is a Roman citizen? Paul states that he's a Roman citizen because he's chained between 2 guards that have 22 rifles. And he says, you should let me loose because I'm a Roman citizen. So it's 22 of the book of Acts. And Timothy comes to Paul while Paul is in prison. Remember, you've got this Timothy hay that is there, and the stool is made out of hay, and you have to sit down on the stool, which gives you 3, and that's Timothy coming to Paul. And that's in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. And how about there is no condemnation for those who walk not according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit? Remember, you're skating in the book of Romans, and you're skating and you're trying to catch the wall, but the wall, there's condensation on the wall, so that's Romans chapter 8. And how about God has made us kings and priests? Remember, you go into the room for the book of 1 Peter, and you have these robes that you can put on, of kingly robes or priestly robes, and you can choose whichever robe that you want, and that happens to be in chapter 2 when you turn the light switch on. And how about, we've only got a few more questions here, how about the statement, in these last days? You find that in Hebrews chapter 1 and 1 Peter chapter 1, where there was in both chapters, where there is a tree that has been there since Jesus was crucified, because that tree is a tree that they made the cross, and also that tree will be there until the very last day. So in these last days is found in Hebrews chapter 1 and 1 Peter chapter 1. How about submit to God and the devil will flee from you? Submit to God and the devil will flee from you. Remember, you get into your car and you reject the devil and you don't let him in, and you submit to God and you chase the devil while he's fleeing from you. So you're in your car, and that was in the book of James. And here's the last one. Pray without ceasing. Do you remember that you're in the book of 1 Timothy and you're putting your hands together and you're praying, and as you are praying without ceasing in the book of 1 Timothy? This is how easy it is to review the Gospel Memory Course. And if you'll download that workbook, you'll be able to do this review anytime that you like. And I want to encourage you to practice this every single day. Do a chapter, do a particular verse, do chapter 5 maybe, or chapter 5 of every book. Try doing that sometime. Try various ways of practicing this. We are going to be moving on to other things now. We're going to be doing the Gospel Memory Course in the Old Testament, as well as 15 minutes in the book of Revelation. If you like this, be sure to give me a thumbs up. share it with a friend, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't subscribed yet. If you have subscribed, don't hit that subscribe button or you'll unsubscribe. But hit that subscribe button if you have not subscribed. Ring that bell, and be sure to choose all so that you'll get a notification every time a video comes up. God bless. Happy memories.